All right, so this lesson today is on 1.2, how energy is transferred in the biosphere. So just some review of some terminology. Ecosystems, these are made up of all the organisms that live in an area and the physical environment of that area. So basically, ecosystems are the living components and the non-living components of an area. So that's what it means by the physical environment of that area. So recall that biotic factors are the living things and abiotic factors are the non-living components. So any physical environment such as the water, the temperature, any inorganic substances like minerals and rocks and sunlight, those are all abiotic factors. Biotic factors are anything living. So again, to remember that, bio means living, abio would mean non-living. And then an ecosystem is made up of biotic and abiotic factors. So next we're going to talk about trophic levels. So if we look at this diagram here, organisms can be identified by how they obtain their food, or by consumer level, or by their trophic level. So last class we had talked about producers and consumers, also called autotrophs or heterotrophs. So when we talk about a trophic level, it's a category of living things defined by how it gains its energy. So the first trophic level contains autotrophs, and each higher level will contain heterotrophs. So if we look at the very bottom, that's energy is coming from the sun, and it's the producers that are going to take in that sunlight to make their own food. So photosynthetic organisms would use the sunlight. We talked about chemosynthetic last class. These are the organisms that, for example, live in deep in the oceans, and they use chemicals instead of light to produce their own food. So the first trophic level, producers or autotrophs. Moving up, we have the second trophic level. These are going to be the primary consumers or the herbivores. Keep moving up, we have the third trophic level. These are the secondary consumers, such as carnivores. And then keep moving up, we have the fourth trophic level, which are also called tertiary consumers. Usually they are the top carnivore, such as a lion, polar bear, or an orca. So they don't have a predator. They are the top carnivores. And lastly, we have the decomposers. These are the consumers that feed at all trophic levels. So recall that decomposers, they eat the dead or waste material. Okay, so next, when we talk about trophic levels, we have to understand that only a small fraction of the sun's energy is transferred from one organism to another within an ecosystem. So energy flows between producers and the various types of consumers. But the available energy from one trophic level to another actually decreases with each transfer. And this is evident in food chains, in food webs, and in energy pyramids. We'll take a look at that a little bit closer. But here again, we have the sun, and then we have the producers, which are the autotrophs, and then we have the heterotrophs, so herbivores, carnivores, and then the decomposers. All right, trophic levels. Again, here, organisms can be identified in many ways, such as their feeding relationships. Organisms can also be organized into these trophic levels. These levels indicate the amount of energy available to organisms. So usually food webs and food chains are used to represent the feeding relationships in an ecosystem. But you should also be able to identify the trophic level of an organism given a food web or food chain. So again here, we got the plants, the herbivores, primary predator, secondary predator. So just to recall, like you've probably learned this in like elementary, junior high. So a food chain, it just shows a linear pathway through which food is transferred from producers to the primary consumer and then to higher trophic levels. Whereas a food web is showing, it's a model of food energy and it shows the connection among food chains. All right, so for example, on the right, we have two different food chains here. A terrestrial food chain on land. Here's a marine food chain, so an aquatic food chain. And then this diagram here on the bottom left is showing a food web, so much more complex. It's showing how all the food chains are connected. And keep in mind that organisms will eat more than one type of food. All right, so energy transfer and trophic levels. Each time energy is transferred in a food chain, some of the energy is transformed into unusable heat. So that heat that's given off, kind of like a waste heat. We talked about that last class. And so here's an example. It's a grizzly bear, and it shows us what's happening to each part after he's eaten. For example, he's eating this fish here. So what is happening with all the, one second. All right, so this bear, we were talking about energy. So again, these are estimates, but what we're seeing here is that very little energy is transferred to the bear for growth and maintenance. Cellular respiration enables the bear to access the energy in food so that it can roam, it can hunt, stay warm, reproduce, and survive the weather. So it varies among different kinds of organisms. It ranges between 5% and 20%, how much energy is actually transferred from one trophic level to another. So about 80 to 95% of the chemical energy that's available at one trophic level is not transferred to the next one. So for convenience, we just use a 10% rule. So we just use 10%. So 10% of energy at one trophic level is transferred to the next trophic level. And it's called the rule of 10 or the 10% law. So again, this diagram is showing again that as energy is transferred, a large percent of it is lost and is not transferred to the next trophic level because the organism has to use that energy for itself, for daily activities, growing, moving, reproducing. So much of the energy that they captured is lost as heat and other waste products. So the amount of energy lost varies. It's usually around 90%. So that means that only 10% of the energy captured by an organism is available to be passed on to the next trophic level. And again, it's called the rule of 10. All right, so in this diagram, we can see 100% primary producers. And then as we go up the food chain, it's 10%, it's 1%, 0.1%, and then 0.01%. And energy is always lost as heat. All right, so we'll pause here. We'll quickly watch this video on food webs, energy pyramids, and also the rule of 10. All right, continuing on, our next is we're going to look at ecological pyramids. So these pyramids are an effective way to represent energy, mass, or number relationships between organisms at different trophic levels for a given ecosystem. So the three that we're looking at are pyramid of numbers, pyramid of biomass, and pyramid of energy. So stable ecosystems will have a greater biodiversity than unstable ecosystems. Basically, if there was some sort of change, ecosystems that have a greater diversity of organisms would be better able to withstand that change. So the example here that's given, a primary consumer in a tropical rainforest will have more types of food available to them than a primary consumer in a temperate grassland ecosystem. So if there's a drought one year and the growing season is short, all consumers in a temperate grassland will feel the impacts of the decreased grasses. Whereas if it was in a tropical rainforest, because there's so much variety of producers, this will allow organisms to use alternate food sources, so making them less likely to die off. So let's take a look at our first type of pyramid, a pyramid of numbers. So it represents the number of organisms at each trophic level. That's why it's called pyramid of numbers. So here in this first diagram, it's a grassland ecosystem showing the relative numbers of organisms at each link in a food chain, and therefore at each of the several trophic levels. So you've got the grasses, mice, snakes, and then we have the hawk at the top. Most pyramid of numbers will have an upright shape, like the one we just looked at. But it can vary for some ecosystems. So, for example, if the size of one organism is very large, it can feed a number of consumers. So, also, if organisms that reproduce very quickly, they can feed a larger number of consumers because they're always replenishing their numbers. So if we look at this example here on the right, it's a reversed pyramid of numbers. It's a woodland ecosystem, so a single tree, which is at the first trophic level, a single tree may be feeding thousands of plant-eating insects at higher trophic levels. So that's why we see this reversed pyramid of numbers. Next is a pyramid of biomass. So looking at the diagram on the left, a pyramid of biomass, it's showing the relative dry mass in grams per square meter. And this is a bog ecosystem. So there's some examples here. So producers at the bottom, like moss and other producers, primary consumers like moose and elk, hare and lemming, secondary consumers like the snake, the shrew, tertiary is like the lynx and the gray owl. So this is an upright diagram of a pyramid of dry mass. But again, it can be inverted, just like we saw in the pyramid of numbers. A pyramid of biomass can sometimes be inverted as well. And again, example would be in the case of quickly reproducing organisms. So here's an example of an inverted pyramid of biomass. This is an ocean ecosystem. So the mass of zooplankton in the second trophic level is greater than the mass at the first trophic level of the phytoplankton on which they feed. And next is a pyramid of energy. This represents the available energy at each trophic level. So all pyramids of energy reflect the flow of energy through an ecosystem with loss of energy. Again, it was about 90% at each trophic level. So all pyramids of energy are upright because energy is always available from the first trophic level, and it decreases as it moves up the trophic level. So this here, it's showing, doesn't say what type of ecosystem, but it is a pyramid of energy, and it is showing that there's a 10% loss. Sorry, 90% loss, 10% is being transferred from one trophic level to the next. So showing here 10,000 joules of energy, then it's 1,000 joules of energy, 100, and then 10 joules of energy. So again, that is the rule of 10, but keep in mind that the rate of efficiency can vary from 5 to 20%. And this is just a quick summary of ecological pyramids. So energy is always upright. Biomass can be upright or inverted, and same as number, it can be upright or inverted. Next, we're just going to talk about bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation is when a substance builds up in an organism over time. Usually we're talking about some sort of toxin. So for example, if a fish feeds on plankton in polluted waters, they're going to accumulate more of that toxin as they consume more plankton. That toxin doesn't get excreted because it usually gets accumulated in the fatty tissues. And then biomagnification is the magnification of a toxin as it moves up the food chain. So if a predatory bird feeds on fish that have stored toxin, the concentration of the toxin in the bird is going to be higher than in the fish because of the quantity of fish that the bird is going to eat. All right, so this diagram here is just showing bioaccumulation. It's building up in the tissues, and then biomagnification as it's going through the food chain. As you go higher up the food chain, there will be a higher concentration of that toxin as you move up the food chain. Okay, let's quickly go through this example of biomagnification. It's called a fish story. So fish are an excellent source of energy and nutrients. In recent years, however, scientists have reported finding toxic chemicals in fish. For example, methyl mercury. It's a toxic form of mercury. So chronic exposure to this methyl mercury damages kidneys, the liver, the nervous system, and in pregnant women, it can also interfere with the brain development of the fetus. So some chemical compounds can break down more readily than others, but some chemicals like mercury are persistent, meaning they resist decomposition by microorganisms or by environmental conditions, and as a result, they remain in the environment for decades. So mercury, which actually occurs naturally in rocks and some natural processes, will release mercury into the soil and water. But the toxic form, this methyl mercury, is coming from human activities like improper disposal of batteries, fluorescent lamps, burning of hospital waste, burning coal for fuel. It releases a significant amount of mercury into the environment. Some microorganisms in the aquatic systems, they take that elemental mercury and they can convert it to methyl mercury. Plants and animals will easily absorb that. And over time, that methyl mercury accumulates in the tissues of aquatic organisms, and it increases as we go through the food chain from the lower trophic levels to the higher trophic levels. And again, that process is biomagnification. So we'll watch this video here on biomagnification.